My name is Emily, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who cheats on her husband. But life has a strange way of peeling back layers you never knew you had. It started in the most unexpected way during a trip to visit my father in Vermont after nearly 3 years of barely speaking. He'd remarried a woman named Linda years ago, and had a son from that marriage named Ryan whom I had never met. I always thought of him as some distant footnote in my father's new life, someone whose existence was barely real to me. But when I arrived at the house and he opened the door, I felt something shift inside me immediately. He was tall, lean, with messy, dark hair, and a sarcastic spark in his eyes that made me instantly uneasy and intrigued. He smiled in this half-crooked way and said, "So you're the famous big sister," and I laughed even though I didn't feel like laughing at all. We had dinner that night, and I sat across from him, unable to keep my eyes off the way he moved, the way he gestured with his hands while telling stories, and how his voice dropped slightly when he looked at me directly. There was an edge to him, something hungry and controlled all at once, and I could feel it in the air like electricity trapped in a jar. At first, I thought it was just tension, maybe the kind that comes from strangers being forced to act like family, but the second night proved me wrong. I couldn't sleep and went downstairs to get a glass of wine and found him sitting in the dark on the back porch smoking a cigarette and staring at the trees. He looked over and said couldn't sleep either, and I nodded, joining him without really thinking. He poured me some wine from the bottle he had beside him, and we sat in silence for a while before he asked me what my life was like. I don't know why, but I told him the truth. I told him I was tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't, tired of smiling when I wanted to scream, tired of a husband who stopped seeing me as a woman and only saw me as someone who folded his laundry and paid the mortgage. And Ryan just listened, really listened, and when he finally spoke, he said, "You're too alive to be that bored." And the way he said it made my skin burn from the inside out. I should have walked away that night. I should have said good night and gone back upstairs to my room, but instead I asked him if he wanted to go for a drive. We took his old Jeep and drove through the back roads with the windows down and music playing, and somewhere in the middle of nowhere, he pulled over next to a lake and asked me if I wanted to swim. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he just stripped down to his boxers and dove in. I watched him for a second, then followed, shedding my clothes, until I was in just my bra and panties, and the water was freezing and perfect, and he swam up close to me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body through the cold. He looked at me like he'd already touched me 1,000 times. His head, and when he leaned in, I didn't pull away. Our lips touched and then locked, and the kiss was rough and soft and deep all at once. And when he pressed me against the smooth rocks at the edge of the lake and slid his fingers beneath the water, I stopped thinking completely. I don't remember how long we stayed out there, but I remember the drive back being silent, charged, and impossible to explain. The next day, we avoided each other like kids who had done something wrong. I spent the whole morning pretending everything was fine while my body still ached from the way he had touched me the night before. Everything I wore felt too tight, too revealing, like I was constantly aware of my skin and the memory of his mouth on it. I kept catching his eyes across the room, and it felt like we were speaking in a language no one else could hear. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found a note under my door. It just said garage 1 a.m., and I swear I spent the next 2 hours pacing like a teenager high on adrenaline. When I finally opened the garage door, he was already there, leaning against the wall with that same crooked grin, and when I stepped toward him, he pulled me hard against him and kissed me like he was starving. His hands were everywhere all at once, and mine were just as greedy, tugging at his shirt, pulling him closer until I could feel him hard and ready against me. He lifted me onto the workbench and slid my panties aside without ceremony, like he already knew exactly how I liked to be touched. And when he entered me, it was slow and deep and deliberate, and I moaned so loudly he had to cover my mouth with his hand. We didn't talk much that night after it was over. We sat on the cold garage floor, tangled in each other's clothes, catching our breath and avoiding each other's eyes. I don't think either of us knew what to say, because what could we say? That we crossed a line that didn't even feel like a line anymore? That the way I clung to him in the dark felt more honest than any night I'd spent with my husband in the last 5 years? I slipped back into the house just before sunrise, my legs still weak and my lips swollen and raw from his kisses. I lay in bed beside my husband, who didn't even stir when I got in, and I stared at the ceiling for hours trying to understand what was happening to me. The rest of the visit was a blur of secret glances and stolen touches in hallways when no one was looking, a brush of his fingers against mine as we passed each other in the kitchen, a quick grip of my waist while I reached for a glass, a whispered "I want you" again as he walked past me on the way to the bathroom. It was madness, and it felt better than anything I had allowed myself to feel in years. On the final night before I was set to return home, Ryan cornered me in the laundry room while everyone was outside by the fire. He locked the door behind him and pulled me against the washing machine, kissing me like we hadn't just done this 3 nights ago, like it was the first time, all over again. My skirt was up around my hips in seconds, and his fingers were inside me before I could even say his name. I came with my hand over my mouth, biting down on my knuckles to keep from screaming, and when he turned me around and slid inside me from behind, I let go of everything. I didn't care who I was supposed to be. I didn't care who he was supposed to be. He wasn't my brother, not really. He was a man who wanted me, and I was a woman who needed to be wanted. And in that room, with the hum of the dryer and the scent of fabric softener in the air, we moved like two people who knew they were never going to forget this. When I got home, my husband asked how the trip was, and I told him it was fine, that Dad was doing well, and that Vermont was still cold in April. I didn't mention the bruises Ryan left on my inner thighs or the texts he started sending me 3 days later. I didn't say how I now spent every night waiting for my phone to buzz with a new message from him. A photo of his hand on his stomach with a line of text beneath it saying "I miss your mouth," or a voice note of him groaning softly saying my name into the receiver like it was a prayer. It became an addiction. I started leaving the house under the excuse of grocery runs just to sit in my car and listen to his voice in private. I began sending him pictures from the bathroom at work, biting my lip in the mirror wearing lingerie he would never see in person. I told myself it was harmless as long as it stayed in text, as long as it stayed a fantasy. But then he said he was coming to the city for a conference and asked if I wanted to meet him in a hotel downtown just for dinner, just to talk. I said yes before I could think. I got dressed like I was going on a first date, not like I was meeting my not quite brother in a hotel room to blur every moral I had left. I wore a black silk dress that clung to my body just right. No bra, just a whisper of lace beneath, and heels I hadn't worn since my anniversary 3 years ago. I lied to my husband, said I was meeting a friend from college for drinks, and he barely looked up from his laptop, just nodded and said, "Have fun." That should have hurt, but it did, and single quotes not anymore. Ryan texted me the room number, and the moment the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, my pulse started pounding in my ears. I knocked once, and he opened the door in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, collar open, and eyes that looked at me like he was already undressing me with his thoughts. We didn't say much, not at first. He took my coat and hung it carefully, then stood behind me in front of the mirror, gently moved my hair aside, and kissed the back of my neck so slowly I shivered. He said, "You look dangerous in that dress," and I whispered, "Maybe I am." The moment his hands slid down my sides, I turned to face him and kissed him hard, wrapping my arms around his neck like I needed to hold on to something real. His hands gripped my hips, and then he lifted me against the wall, kissing me like he hadn't tasted me In months, even though it had only been a few weeks. I wrapped my legs around him, grinding against the growing heat between us, until he groaned against my mouth and said, "I need to see you," and carried me to the bed. He took his time peeling off my dress inch by inch until I was lying there in nothing but heels and that thin black thong, and he looked at me like I was art, like I was his favorite sin. He kissed every part of me, my thighs, my stomach, the curve of my hip, his fingers never still, always exploring, always learning me again. Like he'd forgotten nothing. I tugged his shirt over his head, ran my nails down his chest, and watched his breath hitch when I touched the waistband of his jeans. He was already so hard, and I loved knowing I did that to him. That the thought of me could still break his self-control. I dropped to my knees in front of him and unzipped his jeans, slowly looking up into his eyes as I took him into my mouth, watching his lips part, watching him lose himself in the rhythm of my tongue and lips and hands. He pulled me up after a while, breathless, and rough pushed me onto the bed and climbed over me, eyes locked on mine as he slid inside me again, slowly, like he wanted to feel every second of it. I arched against him, wrapped around him, moaning his name like a secret, and he whispered things in my ear that made my whole body tremble. He told me he thought about me every night. He told me he imagined this over and over while lying in bed with someone else, just like I did. He told me I made him feel alive, and I believed every word. We didn't leave the room for hours, ordered food we barely touched, laughed about stupid things, made love again slower the second time, then again against the wall of the shower, then again on the floor beside the bed, like we didn't want the night to end, like we couldn't let it. The sun had started to rise when I finally slipped out of the hotel bed, his arms still wrapped loosely round my waist, his breathing deep and steady against my neck. I took a long look at him before I left, memorizing the lines of his shoulders, the curve of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched slightly in his sleep, like he was dreaming of touching me again. I got dressed slowly, my body sore in the most delicious way, and my mind spinning with the weight of what I had just done again. I kissed his temple before I left, not sure why, maybe part guilt, maybe part gratitude, maybe just because I didn't want to disappear without a trace. The ride home was quiet, the city still waking up, and I felt like I was floating in a space between two worlds, the one where I was a wife and the one where I was a secret. I walked into my house, and the smell of coffee hit me before anything else. My husband was at the table scrolling through his phone, dressed for a jog, and barely looked up. When I came in, he said, "Hey, you're back early," and I just smiled and said, "Yeah, it ended sooner than I thought." He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly and told me he'd be back in an hour. I stood there in the kitchen alone, hearing his footsteps fade down the hallway, and felt like a ghost in my own life. Ryan and I didn't talk for a week after that. I think we both needed space to process whatever the hell it was we had created between us. But then late one night, I got a text from him, just one sentence: "Did I ruin you?" And I stared at it for what felt like hours. My fingers hovered over my phone before I finally typed back, "No. You woke me up." From that night on, it became a routine. He would call me after midnight when he knew my husband was asleep, and I would sneak into the guest room with my earbuds and lying on the bed with the lights off, whispering things into the dark that made us both tremble. He told me where he wanted to kiss me next time. I told him where I wanted his hands. He would sometimes just breathe with me, say my name over and over like a prayer, and we'd fall asleep like that phone still warm against my skin. Eventually, he asked if I ever thought about leaving my husband, and I told him I didn't know what I wanted. I was scared, terrified of the mess, terrified of what it would mean to destroy something that looked perfect on the outside just because it felt hollow on the inside. He didn't pressure me. He just said, "You deserve more than quiet misery," and let it hang there like a truth I wasn't ready to hold yet. The thing was, I did start to change. I started taking better care of myself, wearing perfume just for me, Buying lingerie I never let my husband see. Started going out more smiling, more feeling alive again in ways I had forgotten I could. I told myself I was doing it for me, but deep down I knew I was doing it for him. For the way Ryan looked at me like I was fire in human skin. For the way he listened like I was saying something worth hearing. For the way he touched me like he wanted to memorize me from the inside out. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he sent me a photo of a cabin in the woods, a little place he said he found by accident while driving back from a job upstate. It was tucked away behind a line of trees, with a wide porch and big windows and a fireplace inside he said he couldn't stop thinking about me there. He wrote one weekend, just us, no phones, no lies, just you and me. I stared at the picture for an hour before I answered. I said yes without asking questions, without checking my calendar, without even thinking. I told my husband I was going on a wellness retreat, something quiet and digital free. And he actually smiled, said, "That sounds great, you deserve it." And maybe that's what hurt the most, that I could disappear for 3 days and he wouldn't even miss me. The drive up was like a slow unraveling, leaving behind the city, the noise, the mask I wore every day, and heading towards something raw, something honest, something that scared me in all the best ways. Ryan met me in the driveway wearing a flannel shirt, sleeves, rolled up jeans. That hugged him perfectly. And that same look in his eyes, like he wanted to devour me without even touching me. He didn't say anything when I stepped out of the car, just walked up and kissed me like he'd been starving since the last time. The kind of kiss that made my knees weak and my mind go blank, and when he pulled back, I could barely breathe. The cabin was warm and quiet and filled with this heavy kind of silence that made every breath feel like it meant something. He had wine already open and music playing low, and as soon as I put my bag down, he came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and whispered, "I miss the way you smell." I turned to face him, and in one smooth motion, he lifted me onto the counter, kissed my thighs apart, and pressed his mouth against the thin lace I'd worn just for him. I gasped, his tongue slow and focused and wicked like he had all the time in the world, and I realized then how much I'd needed this. Not just the sex, the being wanted, the being seen, the being known in a way that no one else seemed to bother to know me anymore. We didn't leave the cabin all weekend. We stayed wrapped in blankets by the fire, drinking wine, talking about everything, and nothing, making love every time one of us looked at the other for too long. In the morning, he made coffee and kissed me on the shoulder while I sat curled on the couch in his shirt. At night, we showered together, slow hands, soap-slicked skin. The kind of quiet intimacy that felt heavier than words. I told him things I hadn't told anyone before. How I used to write poetry in college. How I felt invisible in my own home. How I sometimes fantasized about getting in the car and just driving until the road ended. He didn't laugh or flinch or try to fix me. He just listened and then told me things he never said out loud either. By Sunday, I didn't want to go home. I sat on the bed watching him pack up and felt this ache in my chest. That had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with wanting more. I asked him, "What are we doing?" And he paused, looked at me with this quiet kind of sadness and said, "I don't know. But I don't want it to end." I drove home in silence the next morning, my body still humming with the echo of his touch, and my mind spinning like a coin waiting to fall. I parked in the driveway, stared at the house for a long time before I walked in, and for the first time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage. I stepped into the kitchen where my husband was making toast, and he smiled and asked if I found peace on my retreat. I nodded, kissed his cheek, and said it was exactly what I needed. And maybe that wasn't a lie, just not in the way he thought. Days turned into weeks, and things didn't go back to normal because something fundamental had shifted inside me. Ryan and I still talked, still met in places that didn't feel like reality, but we both started to feel the weight of what we were carrying. The beauty of The secret had begun to sour not because the fire had dimmed, but because we knew we had built it on borrowed time. He asked me once more if I was happy where I was, and for the first time I didn't know how to answer. I wanted both things. I wanted freedom and safety. I wanted passion and predictability. I wanted the heat of his hands and the quiet of my house, and maybe that was the most impossible part. The last time I saw him, we met in a small hotel by the ocean. He brought wine, and I brought everything I hadn't said yet. And when we lay together afterward in that quiet room with the waves crashing just beyond the window, I told him I don't know how to leave, but I don't know how to stay either. He kissed my forehead, pulled me into his chest, and said, then maybe we don't do either. Maybe we just remember this. And I knew what he meant. We made love slowly that night like we were writing a final chapter. With our bodies, every kiss a sentence, every breath a memory we didn't want to let go of. We fell asleep tangled in a sheets, fingers laced like we were afraid the world would break us apart. In the morning, I woke up alone. A note on the pillow said, you woke me up, too. And I'll always be grateful for that. That was the last time I saw him. I still live in the same house. I still wear the same wedding ring. I still smile in photos and ask about people's days and fold the same laundry the first used to fold before. But now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone else too. I see a woman who dared to want more. A woman who remembered what it felt like to be touched, to be chosen, to be seen. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the lights are low, I still think of the lake. The cold water, the way he looked at me when no one else was watching. And I let myself miss it just enough to feel alive again.